So I don't have a talk prepared, and what I would like to do is to take 10 minutes or so to talk a little bit about the general operation of the journal from my perspective on the inside. And then I would like to open the floor to questions from you all. And I also am going to open the floor to answers from you all, because there are other people in this room like me who have had experience as an editor, and there are certainly people in this room who have had experience as authors, and your own experience may actually shed some light on the discussion. So I encourage other people to jump in here. My goal with you all is to try to demystify the process. It's the kind of conversation I would have really liked to have when I was first starting out. And I hope in the course of the hour that we can clarify some things about what happens to your paper as it's under the process of being considered for publication and the publication process itself, and what your standing is as an author and what your obligations are as an author. So I'm going to begin by asking how many people here have ever submitted a paper for publication. Okay, hold your hands up. Now, take your hand down if you've never had a rejection. Joe, you've never had a rejection? Right, I realize I got myself into a double negative there. So the idea is that all the hands are still up, right? Because getting our papers rejected is just part of the game. And I think I will have some tips about how to deal with rejection and how you can make that process actually useful for your own purposes, believe it or not. So I also want to disabuse, oh, I should have raised my hand, by the way. When was my most recent paper rejected? Probably a month ago. So I want to disabuse you of the notion that you're ever going to get to a stage in your career when you're going to have this publication thing figured out. I was at Harvard last week, and Mike Kramer was there, and we were commiserating about the fact that after 30 years of submitting our papers, we're no better at predicting what's going to get accepted where than we were when we started. And there's a certain element of unpredictability to all of this that if the stakes were higher would be really tragic, but we're only talking about, getting our papers published, so there's always another journal. So I'm going to be speaking to you then both as an author who has his paper rejected and as an editor who must, of necessity, reject papers, or as I prefer to say, declines to publish papers. And I think actually being on the receiving end of rejections helps me be a little bit less callous or a little less cavalier about something I have to do hundreds of times a month. So in the old days, this is probably novel to most of you, you had to send in your paper in 5 copies in a very fat envelope, and you found out whether your paper had a chance or not by whether you got a fat envelope in return or a thin envelope in return. Thin was always good, because that meant they were giving you some requests for revision. These days it's all electronic, and in that sense it's a little bit more fair, because you don't have to be in the United States to easily submit to American Journal. Somebody in China or India can as easily submit to epidemiology as they can to a regional journal. And so I think there's some democracy about that kind of access that's a good thing. It also is good in the sense that the web offers the opportunity at most journals for you to follow the progress of your paper, and you can see where it is in the process. And it's actually a good idea to do that, because sometimes things get stuck. In the old days, the manuscript would fall behind the desk, and you had to call the journal. Nowadays, it might be stuck with a reviewer who's taking way too long or otherwise needs some attention from the office. But the process, let me run through it briefly, and then I'll come back to what you might want to do with various problems. So at this point, I have to talk specifically about the journal Epidemiology because that's the one I know best, but I, of course, deal with other journals in the course of my own research. So I have some sense of how the rest of the world works, but there may be some ways in what I'm describing is a bit particular. At Epidemiology, we get about 900 papers expected this year, and we reject or decline about 2/3 of those without review. And those all come to me. I'm the first line of all the papers that are submitted, and I try to make a decision within a few days whether this paper is going to be a candidate for our journal. And we can talk more about what makes a paper a candidate, but I'll just say now that there are some papers that clearly the authors don't know what we publish. They've never, it looks like they've never even looked at our journal, and so we get something about an outbreak of a veterinary disease in Turkey, and that's easy to decline. So if the paper looks like it's in the kind of the mainstream of what we publish, and it looks like it's pretty well done, it looks like it has a chance of being published, then most of the time I will route that to one of my 4 editors who each has a responsibility for certain topic areas, but they all will handle a lot of things. Once in a while I'll handle a paper myself if it's in my own research area and I figure I can do a better job than anybody else there. And the editor will look at it, and sometimes the editor will say, well, you thought this was a contender, but I don't. And so they send it back to me and we reject that. So most of the papers that we're not going to review go back within a week. And I think that's actually fair to the authors because it doesn't tie it up in a process that really doesn't have much hope of being successful. For the papers that we're interested in, we send them for external review. And we usually ask for 2 or 3 reviewers. And the role of the reviewer is to advise the editor. So sometimes I think authors feel like the reviewers are deciding on the paper. And in some journals, a few they may, but in most journals, it's the editor who decides on papers. And the reviewers are giving advice. And it's a very important distinction because once in a while I'll hear authors say, well, one of the reviewers, true, didn't like my paper, but the other one only had good things to say about it. So shouldn't you get a third opinion to break the tie? But it's not a vote. And in fact, as an editor, I may make a decision different from what it sounds like the reviewers are recommending. So if the reviewers, what I'm looking for from the reviewers is some statement about what does this paper contribute and what are its strengths and its weaknesses. And with that information, then I can make a decision about whether this paper is one we want to publish. And the system does ask the reviewers to say what their recommendation is. If I could take that out of the system, I would, because I frankly don't really care what the reviewers think about it. It's my decision. And sometimes the reviewers will not like a paper, and we will publish it. And sometimes the reviewers will say, this is a perfectly good paper, and we won't publish it. And in those cases, I would say the deciding factor is not the strengths and weaknesses of the paper, but the amount that an editor feels the paper contributes to the field. And so you can imagine these 2 extremes. On the one hand, you might have a perfect paper, perfect study design, perfectly analyzed, beautifully written, and it's the 47th paper about how exercise reduces the risk of breast cancer. Are we going to publish that? Probably not. There's too many other things in the world to waste it on confirmation of something that everybody knows is true, and it's one more point on a meta-analysis someplace. On the other side of the coin are papers that actually have a lot of problems, but they've tackled a really important question. And an example I might mention here is a paper that we got from an African author with an American co-author that was looking at the risk of HIV in 2 tribes in Africa that were culturally very similar but had different practices of male circumcision. And they observed a lower rate of HIV in the community that practiced circumcision. And the reviewers actually didn't like this paper very well. They said, you know, all these uncontrolled possible confounders, blah, 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 blah. We published the paper because I thought it was a really important question done under extremely difficult circumstances where you can't expect the most polished kind of study. And lo and behold, there's no reason this had to occur, but lo and behold, the clinical trials confirmed that observation. So it was right, even if it was an imperfect study in many ways. So I go into all of that just to say that the role of the reviewer is not to make the decision, it's to advise the editor. So we get the editor's, the reviewer's comments, we make a decision, and do we ever write a letter that says, golly, what a great paper. If you just make a couple of changes, we'll be glad to publish it. No, we don't. And part of it, just nobody does that. But I think partly it's also that the editors realize that their leverage over the changes that they want to see in this paper really depends on the author's willingness to do the work. And if the authors think that they can just do a few superficial things and then it'll be published, that really isn't usually what we're looking for. And so, I mean, there are occasions when a paper is so beautifully done that it doesn't need much. But most of the time, what you're going to get from a journal is a letter that says, we're really sorry that we can't publish your paper in its present form. However, if you think you can do a decent job at addressing these reviewers' comments, we would be willing to consider it. And that, even for all its dark language, that is a letter that should make you happy. Because that means your paper was not rejected. Now, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to get accepted, but the fact is that most journals don't like to reject papers that have been really responsive to the reviewer's comments. And I'd be interested in other people's experience at this point. I can only think of one time where I had a paper rejected after I had done a revision for the journal. And that was a case, I think it was actually a situation where the journal made a well, I won't say that. I always think the rejections are a mistake. The journal had a political agenda in mind that then they abandoned, and our paper no longer fit their agenda. So it was actually a very good paper that they decided they didn't want. But I think most of the time when a journal is looking at a revised paper that they're open to, you know, if you've really done a credible job of responding to the reviewer's comments, then you're in pretty good shape. Now, sometimes it happens that the revision uncovers problems that weren't visible before, and that you manage to skillfully disguise in the first version, and the reviewers forced you out in the open, and then the editor may say, you know, this isn't as good as we were hoping it was going to be. So sometimes that can happen. But at that point, you know, you may have, your paper may get accepted. Depends on the journal policy whether they send it back to the reviewers or just make their own decision. It may have to go through another revision or two, but basically at that point you're home free and it's going to get published. Now, how about if you get a rejection? This is one of the tough things. And it's tough because there's an emotional component to it that I think we're better off just recognizing at the beginning and dealing with, not trying to cover it up. Having our papers rejected is like somebody telling us that our kid is homely, right? You just want to punch them. You know, we can't help but take it personally. And rather than, my way of coming to terms with this is rather than scolding myself for reacting this way, I just accept it as part of the dynamic of the thing, and I just have to get over it. You know, it used to be I had to go home after my paper was rejected. Now, you know, walk around the lake and I'm feeling pretty good. We can't help but have this be in some ways a very disappointing and personal thing because we worked so hard on making our papers good, making them right. And if it's not appreciated, it's very easy to blame the person who's giving us this critique. Now, reviewers do make mistakes, and editors make mistakes. So it's not that this is always a fair process. But another way to think about the reviews that we get back, and especially the ones where our papers are rejected, is it's a kind of a mini focus group that you've gotten feedback from. The people who are the reviewers are almost certainly the very people who you had in mind to be influencing when you wrote your paper. They're the experts in their area. They're the people who are familiar with this literature. They're the people who you're trying to change their way of thinking or educate them about some new thing. And if they don't like your paper, there's something to be learned from that. It doesn't mean that your paper is bad, but it does mean there's probably some important ways for your paper to be improved. So one way I have come to terms with a reviewer comment, let me just take an example, where the reviewer says, the authors should have controlled for X. What a terrible thing that they didn't do that. And I'm saying, I did control for X. What was wrong with you? Were you reading this in the bathtub? But the other way to look at that is, why didn't the reviewer get that? Let me go back and look at the paper. Oh, it is sort of buried in that footnote of the table. Maybe that needs to be raised up a little bit. Or that was, the third part of this really long, complicated sentence in the method section, and maybe it wasn't clear what it was referring to. So every criticism is an opportunity to improve your paper. Now, that's not something you're going to see the first day you get the rejection, but sometimes you have to let it cool off for a while and then come back after a while and look at this more objectively. So this is kind of an overview of the process, and I think what I'd like to do now is to let you all ask some specific questions, maybe out of your own experience, maybe out of little things I've noted on this cheat sheet that I handed out, and we can have some conversation around that. Yes?
So this question comes out of recent experience, so it'll be timely in that way. So we all know that, and we spoke about earlier this morning, how important it is to replicate initial findings. So I'm not talking about the example where there's 85 papers already existing to show a strong relationship. So this is a fairly, a new finding. I recently submitted a paper and it was not accepted for publication, and the reason was that it was replicating previously established findings, but in small U.S. population to find this relationship. And so I figured that was a failure of me to show how novel what I had done was. And I'm just wondering if you have suggestions about how, we say, well, we are replicating something that's been found, and that's important, but to make it look like it's more than just that.
I think that's, so I'm going to repeat your question. And so the question is, what is the balance between replication that's useful and replication that doesn't add that much to the literature? And if we think we have a replication that really adds something to the literature, how do we communicate that to the readers and the editor? Is that fair? So that's a really good question. And there's obviously a whole spectrum here of contribution. Everybody would like to write the killer definitive paper that's the first time something's ever been reported. In epidemiology, that hardly never happens. So there's this incremental process of early reports that usually are not so well done, but have an interesting finding, and then later reports that improve the weaknesses of the earlier paper to help establish that some unreported confounding or some other bias that might have been the explanation for the first results were not, because after controlling for that, after improving the study design, you still find the same finding. Or you don't. I mean, but in your case, you were replicating something. So I think it's really important in the discussion to acknowledge the state of the literature before your paper, and then to specify what it is you've done that's a contribution that builds on the certainty of that result, that extends it into other populations, that adds to the generalizability of it, whatever it is. But I think that's important to do. But of course, if you go far enough downstream, sometimes I see papers that this is the first time this has been investigated in Nepalese sheep herders, and that may be true, you know. But is that a paper that I'm going to be able to give priority at our journal? Probably not. So there's also an issue of what the journal's own standards are. Sometimes a replication is a really great replication that adds a lot to our causal certainty is not going to get published in the New England Journal because they're such snobs about first reports, and they have this clinical, experimental focus, and we're just not going to get that kind of paper in the weekly clinical journals. But the main epidemiology journals, that's where those papers should be. And in fact, those are papers I'm looking for as an editor, because one paper you can never trust in epidemiology, but the second or third paper, then it starts to get interesting. Yeah, that's it.
I've had a paper that recently rejected a few times, but eventually got published in a good journal, so I feel okay about talking about this experience. But what this experience and the paper really didn't change much from the first to when it was published. What's changed, and that was based on a lot of the comments from the reviewers, was trying to improve the clarity of the message, not so much through the text, but through illustration and how the tables and figures were structured. And I was wondering if you could comment on that. That has taught me to put a lot more attention on perhaps a single overriding message of the paper, and how really to pinpoint it through the figures and tables. As a corollary of that, I was wondering if you could comment on the impression that I've had that there are too many papers being written and submitted, and that to me probably puts a lot of burden on the reviewers and on the editors, perhaps. And the impression I get sometimes is that that the review is a bit rushed, and I wonder if that is in one way a disadvantage of modern times, but on the other hand, it really emphasizes the point that the paper really has to be clear and fairly obvious, to the reader.
Okay, so I'll try to summarize. The first part of your comment is it's not exactly marketing, but discovering the clear way to deliver the main message of our paper and how important that is. We can't always expect journals to see it if we don't spell it out. And then are there too many papers being written, and are reviewers being too rushed? Okay. So let me start with the first. And clearly, a paper is going to be more successful if the message is plain. And figures are a great step in that direction. I think good figures, I just remembered I had a little slideshow I was going to show about figures. I don't know if it's too hard to get any audio-visual on this, Lynn, but if in the last 5 minutes of this, if I could show my, oh, there's Peggy. That's right. Okay, so I'll just set this over here and remind myself. So I once was meeting with a guy who was an editor at the New England Journal, and he said, you know, we published one of your papers because the figure was so great. He said, I love the figure. I thought, wow. I guess it was worth working on that figure. So it's surprising how many papers come to us, and I have to dig a little bit to try and figure out what the authors think is important. So, yeah, you can't work too hard on focusing in your own mind what the contribution of your work is, and then making that clear in the abstract and in the results and in the discussion. And figures, of course, are a great, and tables are a great way to do that. So it's on this jump drive.
Okay.
Under talks, right? And if she brings it up, I'll find it. So then, are there too many? Actually, Lorenzo, that's worth a sermon right there. I think there's a problem with academic positions requiring people to write papers when they really don't want to write papers. My firm conviction is we should write papers because we really want to communicate with our peers, because we have something we want to say. And if we're only writing papers because we have to as part of our job, from my perspective, that's unfortunate. And it's even more unfortunate if it gets linked directly to money. So if you can publish a paper in a journal with this high an impact factor, you'll get this many thousands of dollars. And if you write a paper that gets into a higher impact factor, you get an extra amount of thousands of dollars. This is making our work into a commodity that I think only worsens the risks of all these terrible transgressions that we read about, faking data, you know, all the falsifications that go on. It seems, so I'm very concerned about an academic structure that makes publications a currency that everybody has to engage in. And I think it undermines the scholarly process, frankly. But, you know, I have no control over the system, and some of you may find yourself in that situation, and you have to deal with it the best you can. I'm sorry for you if you are, because it wouldn't be fun. But I think to the degree we can resist that kind of commodification of our work, we should try to do so. I once wrote an editorial that said, "Stop writing papers," and I did it anonymously. I was very young. But it basically was addressing this point that if you don't have something to write about and you're writing anyway, you're just polluting the water for the rest of us. It's not, you know, that's not what scholarly work is about. But let's give the benefit of the doubt to most papers that come in that they're being written by people who are doing work that they have some investment in, and they want to, they'd like to have it available to their colleagues. So then, are reviewers overworked? I think everybody's overworked. I think the environment all of us work in today is more stressed and more hours in the week than it was 15 years ago or 30 years ago. And as an old guy, I can say that. And I think in our role as reviewers, we oftentimes don't spend as much time on papers as we should. I find, frankly, for my journal, that the reviewers do an amazingly good job most of the time. And I'm humbled and gratified by people spending time at this task that they don't get any reward for. So how many of you have reviewed for a journal? Most of you, okay, and not all of you. It's one of those things that, there's, maybe you get to count them up for your promotion package and get to list the journals on your CV, but, the reward is only in heaven, let's face it. We can put a lot of work into reviews. We often help papers to be better than they would have been, and we don't get acknowledged for that in person. But there's still a part of me that's idealistic enough to say that's worth doing. Even if it doesn't benefit us, it benefits our field. It's part of what we owe to each other. We owe it certainly to our colleagues face-to-face to look at each other's papers and help them in their work, and we owe it to the people who may be anonymous to us, or for whom we're anonymous to them. So I think there's a stretch on reviewers like there is on everybody, but I think there's still, sitting in my chair as an editor at one journal, I can see how much the papers are improved by the input of the reviewers. So I still think that that's a useful process. Yes?
Can you say a few words about tactfully declining to do everything the reviewers suggest?
Mm-hmm. Tactfully declining to do everything the reviewer suggests. This is actually one of the most important things I want to say in this hour. So the thing you should recognize as an author is that you are responsible for making your paper as good as it can be, and that means you are responsible for resisting suggestions that would make your paper not as good. And if you don't take that responsibility, you can't be sure that anybody else will. So it's easy to come up with examples of this. So we have a paper that's under review, and one of the editors says, well, they really should have done a different kind of analysis. Should have been done by this way. And so as an author, or maybe they have not controlled properly for something. I mean, it's usually some methodologic thing. And so if, as the author, we think about it really carefully and talk about it with our colleagues, and we're really sure that the way we did it is right, and the way the reviewer is suggesting it is actually going to make it worse for whatever reason, then we have to defend it. And we defend it by, in the cover letter, laying out the issues very clearly for the editor to see. And so we can't just say, that reviewer is all wet, obviously, doesn't know what they're talking about. You have to say, here are the issues, and you might even, you can approach this in various ways. You can say, when we do it the other way, we get an answer that doesn't make sense. Or just, here are the references that show why doing it the way the reviewer recommends is really going to produce another kind of bias that they're not considering. So you have to lay out the argument in a way the editor can look at it. Now, here's the thing. When the editor is looking at your comments and the reviewer's comments, who has the most weight? It's not obvious. The author is the author. The author's name is going to be on this paper. The reviewer is somebody who spent a day maybe looking at this study. The author spent a year. So from the editor's standpoint, any reasonable argument from the author is going to be something that carries some weight. You have standing at this point. Now, sometimes instead of the editor making the decision, that whole package is going to go back to the reviewer, and you're trying to persuade the reviewer. And the reviewer may look at your comments and say, oh, that's right, I hadn't really considered that. This is the way they're proposing actually will be okay. Or the reviewer may dig in and say, no, this is the way it has to be. And then the editor has to make a decision. But you have to do what you think is the right thing. And I think too often authors, and especially junior authors, may feel like they have to do everything that they're asked to do. So I think there are, of course, some reviewer comments that are like, oh, they want me to say 0.5 and I said half. Well, okay, I can change it. It means the same thing. What the heck? So there's this kind of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, where You can make certain changes that wouldn't be what you would do, but it doesn't change anything. But it's those things that you think might actually reduce the value of your paper in a sense that you have to resist. Kristen?
I feel like more and more journals are asking you to suggest reviewers,
Hmm.
and I wonder what this is creating for conflict of interest. There have been a few things that have come across my desk where I think, oh, I know this study, because even though it's blinded, I know who did it. I'm not sure then as a reviewer what to do about that.
So the question is journals that are increasingly asking for suggestions for reviewers and what kind of conflict of interest that creates. First of all, I'll tell you that occasionally an author will come up to me and say, that was a blinded review, but I know who that reviewer was. And I'll say, I can't tell you that, obviously, but I'd be curious to know who you think it is. Nobody has ever been right. So the first thing is that your certainty may not actually be correct. So then why is it that journals ask for suggestions for reviewers? They probably aren't going to use them necessarily. But sometimes we get into a situation where we're just having trouble finding reviews and you run out of the people who are your usual culprits for that particular topic. And so if the authors have suggested somebody, I may go and look at that list and do a little homework on some of these people, see what they publish, see if I think they look like credible reviewers, and I may use them. We don't ask for that, actually, at epidemiology. And when I'm asked as an author to do that, I try to come up with the names of people whose opinions I would value. And I think it's very hard to predict whether somebody's going to like your paper or not. So I don't even try to go there. I just think, are these people who, whatever their opinion is, I would benefit by knowing it. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I was thinking of it more from the reverse case where as a reviewer, I knew that people who were doing the study. So that it was, I felt like I needed to disclose to the editor, like, oh, you think this is blinded, but it's not.
Okay, so this is, you know the authors. You know that they suggested you as a reviewer?
I don't know if they suggested it.
Okay, so what? Now here's an interesting question. What constitutes a conflict of interest as a reviewer? If you know the authors, is that a conflict of interest?
Okay. It was in this situation, we're collaborating on another project. There's a different project.
They're your collaborators. That is a different issue. When I am reviewing a paper that I know, even without seeing the authors, that it's from a group that I work with, I will say that I'm not able to do that. And it's because I honestly, I think I could do a fair job of criticizing my colleagues. I do it all the time. And we benefit from each other's criticism, but I think it would look bad. I just think it would look bad if it were to emerge that Wilcox reviewed a paper by Claire Weinberg, who he's written 50 papers with. So I think that constitutes a conflict of interest. Sometimes reviewers will say to me, I know who these authors are, and so I need to disqualify myself. I would come back and say, well, the older that you get, the more people you know. So knowing them is not necessarily a reason not to do it. What if you're, as a reviewer, what if you're working in the same area on the same question as the paper? So this is an interesting one. As an editor, I'm fine with that. In fact, that makes you an excellent reviewer because you have really thought about this question in a detailed way that others would not have. As a reviewer, that puts you in a special position because you are now having privileged, unpublished information about what your competitors are doing, and you have to be able in your heart of hearts to say that you're not going to use that information in a way that benefits you rather than them. So it may be that sometimes you might decide to decline a paper just because you don't want to put yourself in that position. Most of us are just too curious to be so ethical. And then we just have to be careful not to, not to take advantage of it. It's clearly a privileged position when we can look at people's unpublished work. I mean, another part of this is you read a paper, fascinating finding. You're having lunch with people and the topic comes up. You got to not say anything about what you just learned. When it's published, then you can talk about it. Until then, you can't. Joe?
As an editor, I've had it a few times where I get a paper review, I make my comments, the journal turns it down, and then sometime later I get the same paper review from a different journal. Well, my practice has been to tell the editors, hands up, I reviewed this before. It's actually easy to review because you get it before I just cut and paste. No, usually there have been some change. This happened, I can think of at least 3 times. Anyway, but as an editor, so my practice, I thought about this. Should I, am I supposed to tell the editor or not? Because everybody knows you recycle papers to the journal. That's not a secret. So I just tell the other heads up I saw this paper before. And in some cases, it is better than I saw before. In other cases, I don't think it is. Anyway.
From an editor standpoint, that's fine. I see no problem with that because number one, hopefully it's not going to be exactly the same paper.
Right.
Number two, it might have gotten rejected. Maybe you reviewed it for Lancet, and now they're sending it to epidemiology. So Lancet may have different criteria for papers than we do. And so I may take your advice in a very different way than another journal editor would. So I'm actually fine with that. And this is actually a great illustration of another point, that when your paper is rejected from a journal, why you shouldn't ignore the reviewer's comments. Why you should find as much as you can to benefit your paper before you send it on, because it might go to Joe again, and I can tell you that Joe will be very annoyed if he had spent hours writing a review pointing out a bunch of things that had to be fixed, and the authors blithely ignored it. And when Joe comes back and tells me that, as he says, I've reviewed this before, and the authors did nothing about my comments, that makes my job very easy. These authors are not trying. They're just fishing around. Yes?
Sometimes that might be a little harsh on the author, though. We submitted a paper on a very controversial topic, and it went to 3 different journals. And although I can't prove it, it seems like we got the same reviewer, one of the reviewers 3 times. I think they were an industry person who was being paid by the companies that produced the drug that we were saying caused cancer. And it was only the 3rd time that we sent it in when it went to the British Medical Journal, who has open reviewer names, that they pulled back their comments to be reasonable based on the science, not based on their personal biases, and the British Medical Journal accepted it and published it. So there's swings and roundabouts. Often the author should be responding to the comments. Sometimes the reviewers are involved.
I think it's really a nice anecdote. And you notice that I explicitly said made the changes that would improve your paper, not make the changes that the reviewer asked for. So I agree. Sometimes reviewers have their own axe to grind, and they make recommendations that we don't want to respond to. And in that case, that's completely kosher. Oh. Okay, good, terrific. I'll just hang on to that till the last 5 minutes, okay? It's only a 3-minute slideshow. Yes?
Could you address the issue of transferring copyright? There's sort of a movement that you want to keep copyright. Where is that headed?
Yeah, the question is, there's a movement to, where do I stand on transfer of copyright? There's a movement to keep copyright. And there's all these kind of issues about open access and who holds the copyright on the final version. I don't have a clear answer to that. And so I won't try and answer it. If you have something more specific, I think part of my issue is I work for the government, so I have no copyright on anything. The government, everything the government employee produces is open access. So I've never really had to deal with it as an author. And as an editor, I find my publisher's practices confusing. So,
I'm in good company now.
Is it not likely to be favorably reviewed by the editor if it comes with a request to retain copyright?
the question is whether it's going to get a different kind of review if there's a request to retain copyright by the author. For my journal, I can say absolutely not. And I would be really appalled if that were true at any journal. But I realize there are a lot of very disreputable journals operating right now that probably that's a factor. But you probably don't want to publish in them anyway. Yes?
With regards to statistical analysis plans, we've seen an increase in journals like the New England Journal of Medicine to include statistical analysis plans along with study results. Is that a trend that you see increasing in places like epidemiology?
So, in other words, the journals are asking for the analysis plan as it existed before the study was done?
Yes. And any changes that were made to it along with as the study progressed.
And any changes that were made as the study progressed. This is related to a larger question about whether observational studies should be recorded before the analysis is being done. So the history of this goes back to clinical trials where it became clear that there were clinical trials that were being paid for by industry that were not being published if the results were not what the industry wanted to see. And so the results would be buried. And then there's this publication bias where it was only papers that had certain kind of results that would be appear in print. And so there was a movement to require clinical trials to register before the study was actually done. So it was very clear what the question was in advance, and then it would be apparent if the study was never published. And so this is just kind of another step along the way where it's implying that in observational studies that we know what we're going to do before we get there. And this is a pretty controversial topic, and one that I find my own opinion changing on. And this is getting away from the subject a little bit, so I won't spend a lot of time on it because there's still one important question you all haven't asked. But to address the question, I'm a little concerned about what's going to happen to observational epidemiology if we discourage people from exploring. And I think it's hard for me to think of a study I've done where I knew at the beginning exactly what my hypothesis was and what my analytic plan would be. Usually I'm just trying to figure out what's going on with the question and where the signal might be, and is it real or is it not? Is it consistent when I look at it 5 different ways? Is it, do I see a dose response? Is the dose response dependent on how I cut my data? I mean, I think as epidemiologists, our laboratory is our data set, and we're constantly sort of, the process of analyzing our data is trying to rigorously look at things in a lot of different ways and challenge our own hypotheses to see if they hold up within our data set. And I would be really hard-pressed to be able to write all that down ahead of time. On the other hand, it's clear there are a lot of observational results that get published that are just, false positives. And maybe we could decrease the number of false positives by having people do more documentation ahead of time what their primary hypothesis is. So I think this is a really important discussion within epidemiology about how we do our work and how we improve our product, and I don't know what the answer is. So the important question you haven't asked is, what happens if your paper is rejected? Should you appeal? So as an editor, of course, my answer is you never appeal. That's just not permitted. As an author, I have to say that I have appealed. And it's not impossible, and it's even not impossible to have the decision changed. But I have to say that it's a lot of work to appeal, and is it worth it? Usually not. I mean, epidemiology is a great journal. I'll be the first one to claim that. But there's also the American Journal of Epidemiology, and there's the International Journal of Epidemiology. And if your paper gets rejected at my journal, it probably has a pretty good chance, if it's a good paper, if my decision was a bad one, I'm getting accepted at one of those others. So, and it's probably quicker for you to just send it to another journal than it is to try to do the appeal process. But I will tell you, I've appealed 3 times in my life, and on 2 of those times, my paper has gotten published. And one of them was the New England Journal. So it's not impossible, and if the stakes are high enough, and you think you have a clear enough reason why you think the process went off the tracks, and you can justify to the editor why it's worth having another look, then you can decide whether it's worth your time to do it. Jim, I'd be interested in your reaction to that. Did you consider appeals?
Yeah, we did. And we publicly said that. I would second your statement about the because they're very helpful. I think they do influence at least our decisions. Last time they come up with things that I didn't. But yeah, we do have an appeal process, and I'd say it's just about what you said. If the author has a good reason, you look at the paper again, look at the reviews, and you might send it out for another review. Get another opinion.
Right.
Sometimes it's really.
So I think editors are most editors, some editors, the ones in this room, are open to reconsidering. My experience as an editor is that probably 3/4 of the papers that I have reconsidered have still been rejected. And it's interesting because I approach it with quite an open mind, and I always send it to new reviewers. And I don't pick my reviewers to be mean, and I just maybe we made a mistake here. I think every editor recognizes that there's some randomness to this process, and it kind of reminds me of a fast-moving basketball game, where the ref makes a call, and it could be wrong. Maybe the ref really didn't have a good view of that foul that went on. But the player has a choice of stopping the game and complaining and making a scene, or playing the game. And I think most of the time just playing the game is moving on is good as anything. So I'm going to end with a very sophisticated lecture on preparing good slides. And I'll preface this by saying that visual presentation of data is is really a fascinating process in itself. There's whole books that have been presented on how we can present information in a clean and compelling and truthful way, or how it can be distorted. And I think it's possible for graphs to be quite complicated and informative. It's possible for them to use color and be informative. But I'm going to give you the advice that I give to most authors who are publishing in epidemiology. And most authors do not have well-constructed graphs that they've really thought about. They've just used some package to put together, and they perform the same mistakes over and over again. So this is my closing remarks to you about how to make your figures better. As Lorenzo said, a good figure can really help out. So here are my 3 steps to better graphs. The subtitle, oh, Peggy, I can't make it advance. What am I going to do? I tried that too, and it doesn't. And I do the page down, and it doesn't happen. It's just locked. Yeah, whatever it is, huh? Right.
So while we're waiting, when should you contact the editorial office about the status of the paper? I feel like more than 6 months is mine.
More than 6 months.
Definitely.
My colleague Donna Baird had written a paper, had submitted a paper to JAMA, and I said, Donna, what happened to that paper? It seems like it's been a while. She said it's been 9 months, and I said, well, maybe you should ask him. And she said, well, I didn't want to bother him. I didn't want to get my name on a blacklist, you know. Well, she contacted the journal, and they said, what paper? So the time to check on it is, we're set, good. Or, that's good. The time to check on it is if it seems like it's been stalled somewhere. And in any case, if you haven't gotten a decision in 3 months, say, I think that's fair enough. Authors are sometimes afraid to contact the journal office because they're afraid that there's like this ledger that's kept right next to the phone, right next to the computer, right? And bad author, bad mark by them. It absolutely does not happen. And in fact, as an editor, I'm always a little embarrassed, but I'm grateful if somebody points out that, you know, this paper's been stuck in limbo, and what's happening? And I said, I'm really sorry. I'll take care of it. I'm going to do this. Get back to me at this email if you don't hear something, you know, within a certain time. So I think the fact we can now track it online at least lets us know where it is. But if it's been sitting on the editor's desk for a month and nothing's happened, it's fair to send an email to the office, and they owe you that. Okay, so here's the word on making slides. Everything you need to know, you can learn from. The first rule is to make it squarish. I don't know why this works, but making a graph more square almost always improves it. Just one of those things. Make it simple, dumb it down, and make it loud. Make it so you can tell what it's about from a distance. So here's a very typical figure generated in a standard, you know, software package for showing data. And on the x-axis, it has years, and this is the age of puberty for girls is the red line, and boys is the blue line. Here's the legend here, and this is the cumulative distribution up to 100%. So, you know, the median age for girls is a little younger than for boys. Okay, well, it's, you know, it's kind of pretty, not bad. So let's try our 3 rules. Let's make it squarish. It's just easier to look at. It's just more summarizes things a little bit more clearly. Let's make it simple. You know, color is nice, but really, was it adding anything? Absolutely nothing. And there was no reason to make these 2 lines red and blue. I mean, I always like having color in the journal if the authors are willing to pay for it. But, you know, a dotted line and a solid line is just as good. And do we really need this, you know, for 2 such simple lines, do we need this extra box? You have to kind of translate this line goes to that. You just put the labels right on the line. And, you know, all this years here and half years, you know, single years are fine. Take out alternate points here. Just, you know, simplify. Make it simple. Just focus on the basic message. And finally, make it shout. This happens. I don't think there's a single paper that comes to the journal that doesn't have font that's too small to read. You have to get in there and mess with it, but you can do it. Make all the font bigger, so you don't have to get it. You know, someday you'll be old too. You won't be able to see that small print. So, you know, you want to be able to just glance at it and see what it is, not having to just squint at it. So here's the before, sad, and here's the after. Look how much easier it is to glance at it and know what it's about. Make it simple, make it shout. Thanks.
How would you do that footing?